We are coming in hot with another Age of Sigmar 4th edition faction pack video today. We've got through most of them, although with the Soulblight coming up for pre-order and their new battle tome very imminently on the horizon, I think that is one I am very excited to do as soon as I get my hands on it. But in the meantime, we are looking today at another faction that funnily enough likes to feed, although not specifically on blood per se, more the whole thing. They eat the whole body most of the time, and that is of course the Ogor Mawtribes, who have got quite an old range now, but hopefully they will see some more love throughout this edition because they are quite a cool faction, and if you like a slightly smaller, hard-hitting army that is really fun to play and likes to get the charge off, then these boys may be worth looking into. The Ogor Mawtribes come with the battle traits of Trampling Charge and then a paired ability in Ravenous Brutes and Feast on Flesh. Trampling Charge allows you to pick a friendly Ogre or Rhinox unit that charged in the charge phase and an enemy unit within 1 inch of them, and you roll a d3, adding 2 to the result if your unit is a monster unit, and on a 2+ doing that much mortal damage to the enemy. So it is essentially just some impact hits as an army rule. And now, yes, I get it, it isn't super exciting, and most of the time it's only going to do a couple of mortal damage in the best case scenario. But at the same time, it is quite reliable and it is quite consistent, and it really can help you to thin out an enemy unit or hurt a tankier unit or kill a hero before combat begins, which is really good for your army because whilst you can hit hard, you really don't like being hit back. So it may be a bit tame, but it definitely will help you as your army charges into combat. Ravenous Brutes is a passive that just gives your ogre units +2 to their run rolls, which is fairly solid. It gets your standard ogres a good bit of extra mobility and can help you to get into position or onto objectives when you need to. So again, it is nothing super flashy or fancy, but it is a good solid buff to your units. You do, however, lose this ability when you've used your once per battle ability of Feast on Flesh. This is done at the end of any turn. You pick each ogre unit in combat or that used a fight ability that turn, and you roll a d3 for each of them, and on a 2+, they can either heal the amount on the d3, so either 2 or 3 health back, or they can deal that much mortal damage to an enemy they are in combat with. Essentially, it's a once per game d3 heal or d3 mortal damage to an enemy unit from your ogre unit, which is okay, it's nothing game changing, and I don't like the fact that you lose your +2 to run rolls after you've used it. That is a big pain. I'm not sure why that caveat was included, and I think overall it just feels a bit flat. The extra mortal damage is great, the healing is great, don't get me wrong, but just in general, as far as battle traits go, they do feel a bit unexciting and a bit dull, especially when you compare it to some of the other faction traits that are out there. What about the formations though? Do they bring any more joy? Well, as usual, you get 4 of them. You get Prophets of the Gulping God, which brings you Master Butchers. This gives you +1 to your casting rolls for your wizards. It's solid. It is getting some better, more reliable spell casting, which is always handy to have. So if you are leaning in to a caster heavy list, this could definitely be a good pick to consider. Beast Handlers is your monster themed formation. Brutal Stock gives your Beastclaw Raider monster units +1 mortal damage to their Trampling Charge ability, so getting some even better output when they charge in, and that does turn it into a genuinely quite scary ability in some cases now, able to kill off a big chunk of enemy units or maybe even weaker heroes, as I said, before fighting even begins. Heralds of the Everwinter and the passive Eyes of the Storm is a more defensive formation. This one gets your ogre infantry units -1 to be hit from enemy shooting attacks whilst they are wholly within 12 inches of a Beastclaw Raiders hero. So it's not awful against some armies like Lumineth or Caradron. This will be a big help as you're moving up the board and getting into position. Obviously against some armies like the Death factions, it will be completely wasted. So it's not an awful formation, but it is quite situational, and if you don't know what you're going up against, you could find this does absolutely nothing for you. And then finally, Black Powder Fanatics brings the rule of Feed Your Cannons. This grants Leadbelchers and Ironblaster units the ability to shoot in combat whilst they are within the combat range of a friendly ogre hero. So just boosting your ability to fight off anything that does charge in and tries to tie up your shooter unit, it can just make them a bit more independent from your other melee unit, as long as they do have that hero nearby. So I would say they're not awful formations. Again, they feel a tiny bit anemic compared to some other factions, but they are very, very specific, which is good. So if you are going all in on that one playstyle, whether that be magic focused or infantry focused or monster focused or ranged focused, you can really pick one to benefit a lot of your army. So they can be used to quite good effect, as long as you are building your army to really take advantage of whichever formation you go for. For your choice of traits and artifacts, the traits of Endless Hunger begin with the Great Gutlord. This is a passive that allows the bearer to ignore negative modifiers to his control scores, as well as hit and wound rolls, so making him just a bit more reliable against any abilities or spells that would otherwise make him -1 to hit or -1 to wound or drop his control for objectives and that sort of thing. So it is really nice and really handy. It will have an impact in most games with how many debuffs are being thrown around in 4th edition. Touched by the Everwinter makes the hero a priest, or if they already are a priest, they get to reroll chanting rolls of 1 instead. It does specify you can't chant and cast spells in the same phase if you're also a wizard, and I would say the reroll chant rolls of 1 is only okay. The big meat of this trait is if you have a hero that isn't a priest and you want some extra chants to go off, in which case this one can actually be really good to bring along. Booming Roar is the last trait. This one subtracts 5 from the control score of enemy infantry units in combat with the bearer, so letting you much more reliably charge him in and steal an objective from the enemy, or just make it so that your smaller units have an easier time fighting over objectives with some of the other armies that do have bigger units in them. Overall, I would say they're not awful traits, but Touched by the Everwinter is my favourite, especially if you want to have that hero that is now a priest and bringing some extra chanting to your list. In terms of your artifacts, Gruesome Trophies is the first pick. This is a passive that gives +1 to hit rolls for any Ogor Mawtribes unit wholly within 12 inches of your hero when they attack any monsters or heroes. So it's a really nice aura buff that can make a few units much more effective into those bigger, tougher targets, which for an army like yours is going to be really good because you do have some other buffs into monsters and that sort of thing. So it will just make you incredibly efficient at killing those kind of units. Elixir of the Frostworm is once per battle. This is in any shooting phase. You can pick an enemy unit in combat with the bearer as the target, and you roll a dice and do that much mortal damage to the enemy, and then you heal the bearer the same amount. So potentially doing 6 mortal damage to an enemy unit, and then healing your hero back up 6. So it's a good bit of damage output, as well as a really nice defensive tool. So I do like this one. I think it is really good. Admittedly, it is only once per game, and it is swingy on the D6 roll. This could potentially wipe out an entire enemy unit or even an enemy hero and heal you back up to full health once per game. So it can come in extremely clutch in the right situation. And then finally, we have the Fang of Gur. This is also once per battle, but in any combat phase. This allows you to pick an enemy unit in combat with the bearer, and they can't make ward rolls for the rest of the turn. So into some armies, like death armies or some demon factions, this can be spectacular. Anything that has a ward save or a good ward save to keep them safe and they rely on it, this is going to be so good into. So if you know your opponent is going to have that extra layer of defense and is going to be relying on that layer of defense, this can be a very good pick just to get the most amount of damage possible into the enemy, especially from things like your Tyrants or your Frostlords. You do also get both a spell and a prayer lore with the Mawtribes. The Lore of Maw-Magic is your spells, and we start off with Troggoth Guts as your unlimited one. This is cast on a 5+, and it allows your wizard to pick a friendly unit within 12 inches of them, and they heal D3, and they also add 3 to their control for the turn. So with your multi-wound units in this army, this is a great way to keep them topped up, and it can just also make them a bit better at taking and holding objectives for you too. Greasy Deluge is horrifically named, but this is cast on a 6+. This is a debuff that you put on an enemy unit within 18 inches of the caster, and it gives them -1 to their hit rolls until your next turn. So if you are charging in, or you're expecting them to charge in their following turn, this can make them just a little bit less impactful, and hopefully keep some of your guys alive a bit longer. -1 to hit can definitely make a big difference on your units, because you generally don't have great saves across the board. So any way to make it so that you are being hit less and getting less wounds put through to you is very, very welcome. And then we have the slightly harder to cast Blood Feast. This is on a 7+, but this allows you to pick an infantry unit within 12 inches of the caster and they get +1 attack on their melee weapons. So as you are about to charge in, pop this spell off, get those tasty impact hits from the battle trait, and then get even more punchy attacks to go into your enemy. This can get even your smaller units to quite a scary number of attacks, and it really is going to help because in addition to having fairly bad saves, your hit rolls are generally 4s, so getting as many attacks as possible means you're going to be rolling more dice, which just means you are going to be getting more hits. So they're fairly decent spells, they're all pretty strong and have some use, and if you go for that +1 to cast Battle Formation, they just get a bit more reliable too. So you do have a good number of wizards in this armory. I think you've got 3, maybe 4, but certainly at least 3, so being able to get a lot of extra bonus casting on some of your units can be really handy with the spells you have. If instead you would prefer to go for the prayer route, then your priests get the Everwinter Prayers, and Call of the Blizzard is up first. With a chant value of 4, it's not impossible to get this off turn 1, especially with something like the Touched by the Everwinter trait, and with it you pick a terrain feature within 18 inches of the priest and you put a Blizzard token next to it. It then gains the Obscuring rule, and if you chanted on an 8+, then your Beastclaw Raider unit also get a 5+ ward save whilst they're within 3 inches of that terrain feature until your next turn. Now immediately, potentially turning a terrain into an obscuring terrain feature can be really helpful. It can mess up an enemy shooting unit's day massively and make your army a lot more survivable as you are moving up the board, so it does have some niche value there. But then the 5+ ward is just brilliant, although it will take a couple of turns to build up to those 8 ritual points. It's well worth doing just to get that extra layer of defense on your Beastclaw Raider units. Pulverizing Hailstorm has a chant value of 5, so again that can take a few turns to get enough points to generate, but this one is quite good. You pick a point on the battlefield within 12 inches of the priest, and then you pick each enemy unit within 3 inches of that point, and you roll a d3 for each enemy unit, and on a 2+, do that much mortal damage to them. So against something like a big castled up enemy, this can be absolutely lethal, getting a good 2 or 3 mortals on several units, and if you bank your points up for this one and chant it on an 8+, then you also double the damage you do, so potentially getting up to 4 mortal damage to each of those enemy units, so you can potentially kill off a Chaos Knight or a few Stormcast Warriors, or even a lesser hero all in one go, so it can be absolutely incredible for breaking up and damaging an enemy Death Star style formation. Keening Gale is the last one. This is back to a chant value of 4. Your priest picks a friendly monster or Mournfang pack wholly within 12 inches of him, and that unit can run and still charge, which is amazing, and on some of your faster cavalry style units will be almost game changing in some situations. But if you chanted on an 8+, then you also get to re-roll run and charge rolls, so making you much more reliable in your distance that you can go and making a big charge really quite possible. So I think this is one where getting run and charge by itself is brilliant, but you will probably want to build up to 8 points for this just to unleash a massive charge and get that really, really reliable re-roll on both your run and your charge rolls to make sure that that charge does go off in maybe turns 2 or 3. So the battle traits and formations are okay. They can be rather niche at times, but there is a few good options in there. In terms of your traits and your artifacts, there are a few good choices. There are a couple of duds, but there are definitely ones that you can lean into. And then with your spells and your prayers, there is a lot of potential there. I would say none of them are super standout, but Keening Gale and Blood Feast are probably my 2 favourite, and they can bring a lot to your army. In terms of the actual War Scrolls though, we start off with Kragnos, and we did actually cover him in depth in the Sons of Behemat video, so I don't want to delve into him again too much. 18 health and a much worse 4+ save now, but he has improved his ward save to a nicer 5+. It is overall a bit less defensive than his old profile, which was a 2+ save, 6+ ward, but it's still not terrible. He can still do a huge amount of damage in melee, his mace alone doing around 11 damage into a 3+ save Stormcast, so killing an entire unit of 5 in one go, which is fairly terrifying. He is of course still somewhat pricey at 580 points, but between his solid movement, his decent survivability, and his outstanding melee output, he can definitely be worth it. He gets to ignore spells, potentially with the shield in Violet, as well as giving himself a 3d6 charge as well as any ogre units nearby to him, which in an army like the Ogor Mawtribes, where getting the charge off makes a big difference to your output because of those impact hits, it is very good to have that on them. So I would say he is expensive, but not a bad investment, and especially for the ogres, he can be a great way to bring a lot of force multiplication to them. The first unique unit is your Tyrant hero. The Tyrant is 160 points, which gets you an 8 health 4-up save model with 5 control, which is fairly good. It's got an average 6-inch move, but he's not bad. He does have some ranged output, which is handy as well. 2 shots at 10 inches. They hit on 4s, but wound on 2s with 1 rend and d3 damage, so he can potentially pick off a few models before he charges in. And then he also gets some more reliable mortals with his trampling charge. He adds 1 to the d3 roll, so he can guarantee getting that off and just do a bit more mortal damage to an enemy. He also gets to boost the control of a friendly ogre unit wholly within 12 inches of him in your hero phase with Bully of the First Degree, which gives them +3 to their control score, so he is quite good for helping you with the objective game too. In terms of his own melee output, he is quite terrifying. He's got 3 attacks at 4s and 2s, 2 rend and 3 damage with the crit mortals rule with his Thunder Mace, and then also 2 attacks which are 4s and 2s, 1 rend and 2 damage with +1 rend against monsters from his glaive. So he can do up to 13 damage by himself, which is fairly good. And then with something like All Out Attack or Gruesome Trophies, he can be hitting on 3s as well, which makes him a lot more reliable. So he's a fairly solid, not super expensive hero that can massively help your army in terms of the control and getting some more damage as you charge in. So if you are going for an infantry heavy list, I think he is a good hero to bring. The Slaughtermaster is our first wizard. With 1 cast, he is 140 points and has the same 8 health, but only a 5-up save. His melee is also quite a bit worse. 2d6 stump blade attacks, which are 4s and 2s, 1 rend and 1 damage. And then 3 from the Gnoblar's implements, which are 5s and 5s, no rend and 1 damage. So nothing particularly amazing there, but at heart, he is a caster and a buff unit. Fill the Post means that whenever an enemy unit is destroyed by a friendly Ogor Mawtribes unit in combat that is wholly within 18 inches of your Slaughtermaster, he gains a Grisly Remains point, and he can have up to 3 of those, and then in any hero phase he can use those to pick a Gutbusters unit wholly within 12 inches of him, and give them either a 5-up ward for the turn, or +1 attacks for the turn. So potentially getting you 3 units with a better save and a better defense, or better offense as the battle rages around you. So it's a really nice set of buffs, and against some armies with a lot of chaff units, you will be generating those points very, very quickly and getting some really solid use out of your Slaughtermaster before you even think about his casting. The Butcher is another wizard, also 1 cast and slightly pricier at 150 points. He's only 7 health with a 5-up save, so a little bit less durable, but also a little bit killier than the Slaughtermaster. He's got 3 attacks that hit on 4s, wound on 2s, but with 1 rend and 3 damage, he actually can do some work, although admittedly, still not a huge amount. His rule is Savage Hunter, and that can actually make him very worthwhile though. This brings run and charge to units of Gutbusters wholly within 12 inches of him. So just getting you the absolute most out of your movement phase and really helping you to get the charge off and get those mortals after you've charged with your army rule as much as you possibly can, which, as I've said earlier, in this army is crucial for you winning games. So he is, I would say, almost worth it for that rule alone, just for the run and charge. But on top of that, being an okay melee combatant and a 1-cast wizard does just bring even more use to him. For a more ranged hero, the Bloodpelt Hunter is relatively cheap at 130 points, 8 health and a 5-up save, so fairly standard ogre hero stats. His melee isn't horrible. 5 attacks at 4s and 2s, 1 rend and 2 damage with +1 rend against monsters is actually okay, but he does get some better ranged attacks. The Skull Shatter Crossbow has an 18-inch range with 2 attacks, 4s and 3s, 1 rend and d3 damage, and he also has an Impaling Spear. This is only a 12-inch range with 1 attack, but 4s and 2s, 1 rend, +1 rend against monsters, and d6 damage. They also both get improved with his Beast Breaker passive, which means against monsters, the crossbow is flat 3 damage and the spear is flat 6. Now it's not super reliable with so few shots hitting on 4s, but up to 12 damage at range is a good bit of potential threat, and it might force your opponent to try and avoid him with their monsters, which could definitely help your battle plans. He also gets to use Unrelenting Hunter once per turn in the enemy movement phase, which gives him a normal move if he's over 9 inches from all enemies, so he can use that to really get around the board quickly, to set up shots into enemy monsters even if your opponent is trying to avoid him, or to back away from units that are getting too close to him, or just to get nearer to an objective, so he does have some good mobility in addition to his damage output. Your basic generic infantry units are the Ogre Gluttons. These hefty chunks come in a unit of 6 for 240 points, so up to 12 of them if you felt like reinforcing them, which would be quite terrifying. They are 4 health with a 5-up save and 2 control each, so for 240 points getting you 24 health, which is actually quite a lot for an enemy unit to chew through. They do have a champion and musician, and they are gutbusters, so they get benefits from things like the run and charge buff from your butchers, so that is very nice. They also get bonus control after you've used your Feast on Flesh ability just to help you further with objective play, bumping them to a control value of 3. And then in melee, they have 4 attacks, which are 4s and 2s, 1 rend and 2 damage. So it's not super scary, but it does do around 13 damage to enemy 4-up saves from a minimum unit size, so they can definitely stand there and blunt an enemy charge quite well, and then do a fair bit of work in return. The thing is that obviously you do want these guys to be charging, so you get your mortal impact hits, and then can fight before the enemy, because, or at least usually fight before the enemy, because as I said earlier, you do want these guys killing as much as possible, because yes, they have a lot of health, but with only a 5-up save and no ward, they aren't going to stick around forever as combats draw on. They will die from the enemy unit fighting into them, so you want to kill as much as possible as you can before you start taking any damage back, which is why those charge rolls, getting the charges off, is so crucial for this army, so you can do those mortals and then fight before the enemy gets to fight back into you. Ironguts are your slightly more elite infantry. 240 points gets you 4 of these guys instead of the 6 Gluttons. They're still only 4 health and a 5-up save, so they're no more durable really. However, when they are within combat range of a Tyrant, they do get a 6-up ward. So the play is definitely having them go around with a Tyrant acting as their leader. They also get a once per battle fight twice, albeit with strike last on the 2nd activation, but that can be very, very impactful with their melee profile. They've got 3 attacks each with their Iron Gut weapons. They are 4s and 2s, 2 rend and a flat 3 damage, so they can hit very hard, especially if they fight twice. A unit of these with a Tyrant and gruesome trophies can make for a fairly scary little Death Star style unit. They will kill a lot, and they will at least be a little bit tricky for enemy, or at least weaker enemy infantry units to fight through and effectively kill, just from their combination of their 4 health and that 6-up ward they have. For a somewhat scarier looking unit, the Maneaters are a horrendous lot. They've got some very cool models. They are 160 points for 3, so they're about 53 points per model, 4 health and 5-up save as standard, and they get a cool Ruination Chamber style ability to let them ignore non-core abilities once per turn across your army. So on a 4+ you can ignore things like spells or abilities that do damage before you fight and that sort of thing. It's not super reliable being on a 4+, but it can be really frustrating to your opponent when you do manage to deny that key spell they wanted to cast on you. They also get some token shooting, 1 shot each with their pistols, which are 3s and 3s, 1 rend and d3 damage, so it's nothing super scary, but they can shoot in combat, which does help. And then their melee weapons are a tad more effective. They have 4 attacks each, 4s and 2s, 1 rend and 2 damage. I think my big issue with them is that they don't really have a huge purpose that I can see. They don't do any more damage than Iron Guts or Gluttons, really. Their been there, done that rule is nice for the potential ignore, but it doesn't protect other things in your army. It's only when they're targeted, so it's a good way to keep them alive potentially or safe from spells, but it doesn't act as any other sort of defense for the rest of the stuff in your army. So I just don't really see a use for them when you could bring Iron Guts or Gluttons instead. They look cool, which is nice, but I'm not sure I would include them most of the time when you could just bring other infantry units instead. The next unit we're looking at is one that came as part of a Warcry team, the Gorger Mawpack. This is a unit of 5 for 240 points. They do only have a 6-up save, which is pretty awful, but they get 5 health. So they can actually survive a decent bit of chip damage coming their way. They've got 5 attacks each at 4s and 2s, 1 rend and 2 damage, but they get anti-infantry plus 1 rend. So they are actually fairly good into infantry units and smaller 10-man squads. They'll do about 18 damage to a 4-up save, which is seriously good. And even into a 3-up save thing like a Chaos Warrior, they will do around 14 damage, so killing about 7 Chaos Warriors in a single activation. So they really are brilliant for blending infantry. Their rule of troglodytic lurkers, I don't know if I said that right, troglodytic, I think that's right, that allows them to start off the board and then they can deploy in via frenzied hunters. This allows you to set them up on the board 9 inches from a battlefield edge and 9 inches from enemies, so they can use this to get into some unprotected zones of the battlefield to threaten an enemy flank quite well. They can potentially risk that 9-inch charge to get straight into the combat, although it's very unreliable, but just getting them on the board, maybe hidden behind some terrain somewhere so that in your following turn you can then move them up and charge in, is quite a good play with them. If you instead preferred more ranged output from your infantry units, the Leadbelchers come in at 150 points for 4. They're a 4 health and a 5-up save, and they're only 37-ish points per model. Their melee is awful. 2 attacks, 4s and 2s, no rend and 2 damage. And then whilst their shooting is better, it's still not exactly spectacular. D3 shots at 15 inches, hitting on 4s, wounding on 3s with 1 rend and 1 damage. Now they can get +1 to hit if they haven't moved or they weren't set up this turn with firing from the belly, so that does help, but with only a 15-inch range, that is quite hard to set up until you're in at least turn 2 or 3 realistically. They do also get some powder Gnoblars, 2 of them in fact, which can be used whenever their Leadbelchers shoot. This allows them to re-roll their D3 attacks, so the number of attacks they get, but if you re-roll the D3 into a 1, you have to remove one of the Gnoblars. So essentially a unit of 4 can re-roll 2 of their D3 shot rolls each turn, which does give you a slightly better chance of getting a solid 2 or 3 shots per Leadbelcher. The main issue with them is that even if you rolled the best results possible, so 3 shots for each of them, it's still only 12 shots, and with their output profile, still only leads to about 2.6 damage into an enemy 4-up save, which just really isn't very good. And even if they've stayed still and got the +1 to hit, that still only gets bumped up to about 3.5 damage. So even in an absolute best case scenario, they really aren't doing a huge amount of damage to the enemy. So for 150 points, they can be okay if you want some shooting, but they're definitely not very scary in my opinion. The Ironblaster can be a bit scarier. This is a big war machine. It's 200 points though, and it's 9 health and a 4-up save, but it does come with a whopping big Ironblaster cannon. Lethal payload is the rule that allows you to either fire it as a big shot or a hail shot. The big shot is 18 inches, 2 attacks that hit on 4s, wound on 2s with 2 rend and D3 plus 3 damage, whilst the hail shot is only 12-inch range, but 8 shots, 4s and 3s, 1 rend and 2 damage. Now the big shot will do about 3.4 damage to a 4-up save, whilst the hail shot does about 3.5. So it's still nothing amazing really. The big shot can do up to 12 damage in total, whilst the hail shot could in theory do a whopping 16 damage. So there is a lot of potential there. It's just on average rolling with that 4-up to hit, it's just not very reliable. The melee is also really rubbish. You get 2 club attacks, 4s and 2s, no rend, 2 damage, and then 2 attacks from the rhinos, which are 4s and 2s, 1 rend and D3 damage. I think in general it is scarier output than the Leadbelchers, but at the same time it's also 50 points more expensive, and 200 points for an average 3 to 4 damage at range just doesn't feel all that scary, especially when you compare it to shooting units from other armies. So I'm just not really sure this meshes with the charging in melee focused ogre playstyle all that well. Up next we have another ranged unit, the Gnoblar Scraplauncher. This is more of an anti-infantry piece, and for 160 points this has 9 health and a 4-up save. It is a war machine like the Ironblaster, but this one fires piles of old scrap. It's 3d6 shots, hitting and wounding on 4s with no rend and only 1 damage, but they are anti-infantry +1 rend, and they also have the crit auto wounds rule. So it is actually a few fairly nice improvements, and they can chip down enemy units through sheer weight of dice. It also gets the load it up rule, which gives it crits on a 5+ if it's within combat range of a Gnoblar unit, so potentially 18 shots auto wounding on 5s, so it can be quite scary into chaff infantry. The Reign of Scrap rule also gives it a nice debuff onto the enemy, meaning that enemy units that have had any models killed that turn by the powers of Scrap are -1 to their hit rolls. So it's a nice way to kill a few enemy infantry units and then maybe make them less effective in combat if you then charge into them. So I actually think in terms of all the ranged units for the ogres that we've seen so far, the Scraplauncher is probably the best. In terms of your own chaff unit though, the Gnoblars return in droves. 20 of them costs you just 110 points, so they are incredibly cheap. They are of course also really rubbish, but they are pretty much there just for screening, eating charges, holding objectives, and harassing the enemy. They've got 1 health, a 6-up save, only a 5-inch move, and 1 control. They do have some hilariously named weapons though. Sharp Stuff is their ranged attack, nets them 1 8-inch range shot each, which hit on 4s, wounds on 5s, no rend, and 1 damage. So a reinforced block of 40 Gnoblars can kill 1 Chaos Warrior with all of their shooting, if they could all get in range, which is probably quite unlikely. In melee, their weapons are also 1 attack each, 5s and 5s, no rend and 1 damage, so again, really not doing much at all. Their special rule is that in any charge phase, they can pick an enemy unit within 6 inches of them that used the move ability that turn, and you roll a d3, and on a 2+, you do that much mortal damage to the enemy. So it's a nice way to make a little buffer zone around them where the enemy may not want to go, just in case they do take a few mortal wounds. There's really nothing amazing or more to say about them. They are just cheap. They come in big enough units to block a good number of charges and hold up a lot of enemy units in terms of the footprint of this unit, and they really are there to just eat those charges so your main ogre units don't get charged and they can follow up with a charge in your following turn. So for an Ogor Mawtribes army, that does make them invaluable. Now we get on to the 2 Frostlord units. These are your big heroes on mounts. The first is on a Stonehorn, and for 320 points, this guy has 15 health and a 4-up save with a mighty 10-inch move and a hefty 10 control, which is quite impressive. In any charge phase, he can use his Rampage, and that is the Earth-Shattering Charge. So if he charged this phase, you can pick an enemy unit within 1 inch of him, and you do d3 damage to them. No rolling required, you just do d3 damage to them. Then you roll 2d6 and you can move that distance. You can move through that enemy unit, but you do have to end in combat. So you can use this to move through them to get near to another enemy or onto an objective, or maybe just away from a unit that had a hero nearby to it that was going to, pile into you. So you can just use it to control where you are actually fighting with this unit, which is very handy. He also gets the Frost Spear rule, meaning that any damage allocated to a hero or monster from his Frost Spear causes that enemy unit to have -1 attack on their melee weapons until your next turn. So it's a great way to debuff any attacks coming back into him, just to keep him alive that little bit longer. His durability is made even more impressive with the Stone Skeleton rule, and this is another passive. It allows you to ignore the first damage point your hero is allocated each phase. So this is just a great way to get that 15 health trucking along and keeping you alive for that much longer. In terms of your own output, you have a load of attacks. You get 4 from the Frost Spear, which is 4s and 2s, 2 rend and 2 damage, and 3 damage on the charge. 6 attacks from the Stonehorn's Horns, 4s and 2s, 2 rend, but this is a flat 3 damage or 4 damage on the charge, which is very, very scary. And then you also get d6 hoof attacks, which are 4s and 2s, 1 rend, and d3 damage. So it's a lot of attacks and a lot of high damage attacks. In a perfect storm, this guy can do 54 damage to an enemy, so he's got a huge amount of potential, and I would say he is, for 320 points, relatively cheap for what he can do. Slightly cheaper than him is the Frostlord on Thundertusk. He's just 300 points. He's got the same 15 health, 4-up save, 10-inch move profile. He's got the same Frost Spear attacks as the previous Frostlord, but he has a few different rules. His Rampage is instead Sweeping Tusks. This gives you a once per turn ability in any movement phase to pick an enemy unit in combat with him, and on a 3+, you can roll a dice for each model in the enemy unit, and on those subsequent rolls, any 5-up you roll is a mortal damage. So it's a great way for clearing out big blobs of chaff that are trying to tie him down, albeit a little bit annoyingly, having to roll that 3+ to actually do the ability can mean that it's not going to do as much damage as you may hope. He also has a once per battle ability in Bellowing Voice. This allows him to pick any number of Beast Claw Raider units wholly within 12 inches of him in your charge phase, and they get to each add 1 to the D3 roll for their trampling charge impact hit. So making those charges much more deadly, essentially meaning you can't fail that roll and just doing even more mortal damage to any units they're charging into. In terms of this Frostlord's own output, he also gets a ranged attack with Ice Blast. It's only 1 shot, which hits on 4s and wounds on 2s with 1 rend, but it is D3 plus 2 damage, which isn't awful, just before he charges in. And then the Thundertusk, it only has 3 attacks. These are 4s and 2s with only 1 rend, but it is anti-infantry plus 1 rend, and then a flat 5 damage. So that can be brutal, and will really let him demolish any infantry that is that sort of 1 health 4-up save profile really quite reliably. If instead you want a slightly cheaper version of the Frostlords, then the Huskards also come on either a Stonehorn or a Thundertusk. The Huskard on Stonehorn is 280 points, 14 health instead of 15, and then the same 4-up save. You do get to keep the impressive Stonehorn attacks, but then the Huskard himself, he only adds some fairly pathetic punches and kicks to the profile. Once more, the Stonehorn has that stone skeleton rule to let you ignore that first point of damage each phase, but it has a slightly different rampage now. Everwinter's Goad is once per turn in any combat phase. You pick each friendly and enemy monster within combat range, and you roll a dice for each. On a 3+, it gives friendly monsters the crit 2 hits rule on their companion attacks, whilst for enemy monsters, they get -1 attacks on their companion weapons if you roll that 3+. So it's a great way to boost the output of any monsters you have charging in with you, as well as making things like enemy monsters and dragons much less scary when they do fight back into you. The Huskard on Stonehorn also now gets a choice of 3 ranged weapons: the Chain Trap, the Harpoon Launcher, or the Blood Vulture. They are each only 1 shot, and none of them I would say are super scary. The Chain Trap is a solid anti-monster pick, doing 3 damage and having 2 rend into monsters. The Harpoon is slightly less reliable, doing D3 damage, but it does have a slightly better 18-inch range. And then the Blood Vulture has the longest range at 24 inches, but it's only 1 shot, hits on 2s and wounds on 3s, which isn't bad, but then no rend and only 1 damage. So it's just not really going to kill much, even over the course of the entire battle. So it's okay, but I do think these are more of a debuff piece with that excellent rampage ability into enemy monsters. The Huskard on Thundertusk is cheaper still at 270 points. He's got many of the same aspects, the same health and movement, the same choice of ranged weapons and his rubbish punches from the Huskard himself. He also keeps the Ice Blast and Colossal Tusks from the Thundertusk we saw on the Frostlord. The main changes here are his Rampage, which is Freezing Aura. This lets you pick an enemy infantry unit in combat with you in any combat phase, and you roll a dice, and on a 4+, the enemy unit gets Strike Last. You also get +1 to the roll if the enemy had Strike Last turn, so you can somewhat reliably keep debuffing that enemy and keep that enemy on Strike Last turn after turn after turn, making sure that all of your other attacks will be hitting them before they can swing back. So again, it's a nice little debuff piece, and it can combo quite well with some of your other units to make sure you get into combat and get as much damage done into the enemy before you take any hits in return. The Stonehorn Beastriders are a unit of 1 that comes in at 270 points. They're not a hero, this is just a monster unit. It is essentially a Stonehorn as far as rules go: 14 health, 4-up save, 10-inch move, the same stone skeleton ability to ignore some incoming damage. It also has the exact same Stonehorn attacks with its hooves and horns, and then also the choice of the same 3 ranged options in the Chain Trap, the Harpoon Launcher, and the Blood Vulture. So it's got some token shooting, but it is mainly a melee unit. It comes with a unique rampage in Stonehorn Avalanche, which lets you roll a dice if you've charged, and on a 3+, you get an extra d6 inches when you pile in. So this can be good to help you get another enemy unit into combat, or move into a better position onto an objective, which could help with your hefty 10 control. I would say it's not a bad rampage, it's just, as ever, relying on that 3+ means it's not always going to go off, and he doesn't really do anything else, so this can be a bit feels bad when you roll that 1 or 2. It's not a bad unit, it's definitely not as good as the hero versions, but if you are running a monster mash list, you will definitely want a few of these in your army just to fill out those regiments and, get some support for your heroes on these mounts. Equally, the Thundertusk Beast Rider is the similar non-hero version of the previous few units we've seen. This is only 220 points, so it's a whopping 50 points cheaper than the Stonehorn variant. 14 health with a 4-up save, again, basically identical to the Thundertusk profile we've seen before. The 5 damage Tusk attacks, the choice of ranged options, in addition to the Ice Blast. Where this unit varies is that its rampage is Everwinter's Assault. This is done once per turn at the end of any turn, once again relying on that 3+ roll, but you get to pick an enemy unit in combat with it, and if you roll a 3+, that enemy unit gets -3 to its control if it's a monster, or -5 if it's not a monster. So just really helping you steal objectives from the enemy, and if you are running a monster mash list, you are going to be very low model count, so even with your good 10 control on these units, it can just make it much easier to flip an objective and take it if your opponent had a bigger unit of infantry sitting on it with that -5 to their control. Like the Stonehorn Beast Rider, it's not bad, and you are definitely going to want some of these in your army if you are running Monster Mash. They are just not as good as the hero versions of them. But at 220 points, he's not too bad, he's not too expensive, he's got a fairly good amount of health, a decent save, some good damage output, and if you are taking hero options of those in their regiments, you will need some of these just to fill out the slots. Up next, we have the Icebrow Hunter, another hero choice, only 120 points, 7 health and a 5-up save. He is a bit techy alongside some Frost Sabres. He can deploy off the board alongside 2 units of Frost Sabres, and then they come on with the Hunt is On rule. This allows him to arrive within 9 inches of a battlefield edge, 9 inches away from enemies, and then the 2 units of Frost Sabres are set up wholly within 12 inches of him, also 9 inches away from enemies. So this can just be really good to put some more pressure onto the enemy backfield early on, which is useful. He does also have some ranged. He's got a crossbow and a spear. These can both be in range the turn he arrives because they have a 10 or a 12-inch range. The spear is 10 inches, 1 attack, hitting on 4s, wounding on 3s, 1 rend and D3 damage. And then the crossbow is 12-inch range, 4s and 3s, no rend and D3 damage, but both are +1 rend against monsters. So he can feasibly arrive and do a little bit of chip damage to an enemy monster, or even kill one that has been wounded by some other shooting earlier on. So he can just pop up on a flank and just threaten your opponent, make them second guess their deployment if they are worried about a monster that they've got on the flank. So he can be a big factor in helping you win the game just by making your opponent make mistakes. But overall, he's not super scary. He's not going to kill monsters by himself with his shooting, and he isn't super tanky. So if they do decide to go towards him and charge him after he appears, he isn't really going to be able to fight much off. His friends in the Frost Sabres can of course help defend him a little bit though. They come in a unit of 2 for 70 points, so just 35 points each. They are 3 health with a 6-up save. They do also only have a control value of 1 because they are beasts, so they are very, very bad for taking and holding objectives, but they can be deceptively durable against enemy shooting because they are not visible to enemy units when they are within 3 inches of a terrain feature and 9 inches from enemies. So you can use that fact to get them up the board and into position without being shot really quite reliably. They do also have 3 attacks each. They're 4s and 3s, 1 rend and 1 damage, so it's nothing super scary, but they are quite cheap and they can either be fairly solid screens for things like your hunter, or they are actually reasonably okay at going into and killing weaker enemy chaff just to clear the way for some scarier charges from your actual ogre units. One of the terror units of old Warhammer Fantasy was the Mournfang Cavalry. The Mournfang are a unit of 2, they cost 180 points, so they're 90 points each, 6 health with a 4-up save. They can have a musician and a standard bearer, but it's only a 1 in 4 option. So if you want the champion and full command, you do need to reinforce them. But they can be a very scary addition to a list. Lumpen Wall of Flesh is a great defensive tool which makes the enemy -1 to wound for any shooting that goes into a Beast Claw Raider unit within combat range of your Mournfang, so helping you keep your wall of meat alive as you get up the board. And then if this unit does get charged, these guys are super durable because any charge +1 damage rule doesn't affect them. So things like Chaos Knights or Blood Knights, most cavalry really that gets +1 damage on the charge is just going to be much less effective into them. Chaos Knights will be only 1 damage rather than 2 when they've charged into them, so they are going to be much less of a threat even if you don't manage to get the charge off with your Mournfang. And then in combat they also don't rely on charging as much because they are still just very decent even without the charge. 3 attacks from the Riders, which are 4s and 2s, 1 rend and 2 damage. They do get a bonus rend into cavalry as well, but it's not dependent on the charge. And then Mournfang Tusks, which are from the mounts. These are 4 attacks, 4s and 2s, 1 rend and 2 damage. So up to 14 damage per model, and they are just really good that they can take a charge super reliably and then just happily chew through even tougher cav quite well and then just move up and on to their next target. If you wanted more casting and another wizard, then we do have one more for you. The brilliant model of the Firebelly is 140 points and is a 1 cast wizard. 7 health and a 5 up save, so fairly standard there, but he does also have a shooting attack in his Fire Breath. It's only an 8-inch range, but it's 6 shots that hit on 2s, wound on 3s. It's no rend and it's only 1 damage, so nothing terrifying, but it can be shot in combat, so it can be a great way to kill off some chaff trying to bog him down, and it is 2 damage against infantry thanks to Torrent of Flame. So he can actually do some noticeable work there, getting around 3 damage into a 4-up save with it, so that actually is quite good for killing off some smaller chaff units that are trying to get in your way. His hammer is 3 attacks, 4s and 2s, 1 rend and D3 damage, so again that's not a shabby bit of extra damage just as he goes in. So if you just need another wizard and one that can clear out screens and chaff quite reliably and is just okay in combat, he is not a bad addition to bring along. The last main unit for the Ogor Mawtribes is the Icefall Yetis. 3 in a unit for 100 points. They are 4 health and a 6-up save, but they do get a 6-up ward, so they're still not super tanky, but they are one of the few units in the entire army that can get a ward. They can also move in the enemy combat phase with bounding leaps. It's only a 3-inch move, but they can move into combat, so you can definitely use this to catch an enemy off guard. And then in melee, they have 3 attacks each, which are 4s and 3s, 1 rend and 2 damage. So it's nothing amazing, but being able to sneak into combat without having to charge and in the enemy turn is a fairly sneaky little rule, and they can be a great unit to just tag on and threaten the enemy with another infantry unit that they're going to have to deal with if they do try to get close to your lines. And they can almost work as a little counterpunch unit if they charge something like your Gluttons and you've got the Yetis nearby. They can then move in and just add their damage to the Gluttons that are already in combat. Finally, we get to the terrain features. The ogres have 2. You have the Great Mawpot and the Mawpit. The Mawpot is 6 health with a 5-up save. It can't move and it starts the game full. Whenever an enemy model is slain within 6 inches of it, if the Mawpot is empty, it becomes full. And whilst the Mawpot is full, in your hero phase, you can pick a friendly wizard within 3 inches of it, and they get +1 to their power level. So essentially, becoming a 2-cast wizard. Also, if it's full, you can heal D3 for each friendly unit wholly within 18 inches of it, which is a huge range, and it can really help to keep your multi-wound units alive for much longer. If you do this though, then the Mawpot then becomes empty, but this is great for getting some more reliable casting, and then in the mid-game, when the fighting is happening and you've taken some damage, just getting a big chunk of your wounds back on potentially quite a lot of your units. The Mawpit, on the other hand, also can't move, but it has 10 health. This terrain feature allows you to feed them more in your command phase, picking a Butcher or Slaughtermaster within 3 inches of it and not in combat, and they become the Head Butcher. They lose the Head Butcher rule in your following movement phase if they weren't placed on the terrain feature this turn, so essentially you need to keep choosing or re-choosing the model that you want to be the Head Butcher for this piece, or it loses its buff. But it then gains the Altar of the Gulping God rule, which is essentially your Head Butcher is embarked on the feature, he can't move, he can't be targeted with attacks, instead they all go into the terrain feature first, and then what this terrain does is that it brings you the Throat of Gur rule. And in any hero phase you get to pick 3 enemy units within 12 inches of it, or within 18 inches if you have a Head Butcher, and you roll a d3 for each, and you do that much mortal damage on a 2+. So it's a nice bit of chip damage to any enemies that are nearby to it. And having a Head Butcher on there means that 18-inch range is quite a big distance. You can set this up nicely in your deployment and it will protect a lot of objectives. It will cover probably at least a couple of objectives so that if the enemy is trying to get near them, you can start chipping them down before you even get into combat. Again, really helping your weak save units from taking as little damage as possible. And then when they do get the charge off and get into combat, just adding even more mortal damage to your opponent. So this army, it can do a lot of mortal damage. There is a lot of abilities here that do mortal damage. It's generally only D3 and it does often rely on a 3+ to go off. But there is a lot of mortal damage you can do here, which does really help your output, but also your survivability. And that's the Ogor Mawtribes. They do, as I said, have quite a lot of scary, impressive war scrolls, but I think generally they aren't quite there in terms of power compared to some other factions. Their big monsters are very, very good, but they've got some very weak saves, and overall the army rules and the formations I don't think are spectacular. Your shooting is really quite poor. A lot of your rules rely on those 3-up rolls to go off. So some games it will just be very frustrating because nothing will work for you. Now they can do a lot of damage. They can put out a lot of mortals, as I said, and especially on the charge you are going to be devastating. And I think monster heavy lists can be super durable, really, really mobile, and just put out a huge amount of damage on the charge. I just think that the rest of the roster kind of pales in comparison to those monster and cavalry units. And if you want to run an army that is anyway competitive, you are going to have to just lean in very heavily on those Beast Claw Raider units, which I think is a shame. But as always, I'd love to know what you think of the Ogor Mawtribes and how you have been finding them. Which of the formations has worked best for you? And also, how would you like to see them get improved in their eventual battle tome? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me, but until next time, I'll catch you later, guys.